Peter Craven, what should good literary criticism achieve, and are we getting it in Australia?
Well, I mean, what it should achieve is an accurate representation of and evaluation of what the critic has read. Yes, it should incidentally be attractively written in itself, but I think that can vary quite a lot. And one of the paradoxes which one can encounter in book reviewing is someone who sounds as if they know what they're talking about, but they don't. And personally, that's not something which I value particularly highly. On the question of it failing, I mean, there's a sense, I mean, there's a high and mighty philosophical sense in which criticism is bound to fail, that criticism is a secondary thing by comparison with art or entertainment. George Steiner, in his hammy Middle European way, was not wrong to say in the 60s, when the critic looks back, he sees a eunuch's shadow. Some of the greatest writing which has been about literature is not itself criticism. Like if you think of the Scylla and Charybdis discussion of Shakespeare in Joyce's Ulysses, it's magnificent, but it's essentially an imaginative thing. I think criticism should have an imaginative element, as all non-fictional writing should have, but I don't think it's primarily imaginative. And some of the greatest apparent works of criticism, like that bit of Ulysses, like some of D.H. Lawrence's criticism, arguably, is, I think, it's crypto-critical and it transcends criticism.
Hilary McPhee, are we getting, well, what sort of criticism would you like to see, and are we getting it in Australia?
I don't think we get enough of what we get from stuff coming in from overseas. I really don't think we have the writers here that apart from Peter, of course, that we're inclined to rush to simply because they've written a review. We don't, I mean, the London Review of Books and the New York Review of Books and the TLS, for instance, have writers that have a following as critics themselves. I think I'm hard-pressed to think of very many of those kinds of reviewers that have emerged in this country for very obvious reasons. It's not the fault of the reviewer, but it's the fault of it's the problem of the Australian marketplace, and it's the problem of money, which Gideon's going to talk about. It's the problem of space. It's also a problem of being a kind of ghetto here, which really has bugged me all my working life. I mean, when you talk about Australian literary criticism, are we talking about Australian books? Are we talking about a way of writing about books that's Australian, that is unique in a certain kind of voice to this place, because we happen to be here and we've got a view on the products of this place? Or are we allowed to write, as Peter does at his very best, into a body of literature, a body of world literature in translation, and at your very best you're writing into that world. At your least best you're writing for dough, and you're writing quickly, and you're writing, you know, we know this. So your stuff is patchy, you're kind of exhibit A, Gideon is exhibit B, I'm not exhibit anything, and I think Rebecca is a very interesting exhibit because she's doing it differently, and I hope we'll get to pick her brains about how the whole thing is changing. But what I look for I buy a lot of books still. I'm one of those people who read a review and rush out and buy the book. And it's because the reviewer has electrified me. There's something in the book, in the review, that has made me think, I've absolutely got to read this. And it's often, it's obviously about the subject of the book. For instance, I'm at the moment reading Muriel Spark from cover to cover for the first time for about 30 years because I read a marvellous review by David Lodge in Something about the biography of Muriel Spark, which sent me straight out to reread her. But I think it's terribly important that we have good reviewing in this country, because I think our writers benefit from it. That's the other thing. It's not just for readers, it's for writers. And I think a really stunning review can make a writer write better. It can make a writer think about their tone, the shape of their work. Most writers that I've had anything to do with say they don't read their reviews, they can't bear to, but they all do, and they can quote them decades afterwards. But they're usually the horrible ones they remember. But reviewers can be very, very helpful to writers as well. So I'm in a bit of a muddle about the subject, really.
Well, I don't think we've had a definitive answer from either Hilary or Peter yet, but I think we might get one from Gideon Haigh. And Gideon Haigh recently wrote an essay on literary reviewing in Australia, called Feeding the Hand That Bites, the demise of Australian literary reviewing, which was published in Kill Your Darlings, which is why I think he's got some strong words to say. Gideon Haigh.
Well, it wasn't really an essay, it was more sort of a bilious fit written in sort of half an hour, because I just, wanted to get some things off my chest, so, I wouldn't read too much into it. But it did express some abiding feelings that I've had about the quality of reviewing in Australia. I mean, I'm not just a writer and a reader of books. I'm an avid consumer of the books pages in Australia, have been since I was a kid. I know John Dale was saying in the ALR last week that the first thing he did on Saturday was he read the sports pages, then he read the books pages, and I'm pretty much the same. Well, I look at the books pages in the mainstream media now, and they're basically, the same, just smaller than when I started reading them. You get reviews, you get interviews with authors, and, well, that's it, really. It's not very vibrant, it's not very engaging. I think I'll always read books pages, I imagine, because I'm that kind of person. But I'm bound to say I struggle to find much original thinking or much really diverting prose on them these days. One area in which I think that reviewing is not keeping pace with Australia, and we would like to think that Australian literary culture was better than it was 10 years ago, or 20 years ago, or 30 years ago, is that it's just not reviewing enough. The books pages are pretty well static. I think I'd be interested to see some empirical research on this, but if you think back to the age, say 30 years ago, you would have had the books pages in the Saturday Extra, you would have had the Age Monthly Review. That was a lot of reading for the average reader. Now, the pages in the Age, and I don't mean to single the Age out here, but it's probably the paper that we first turned to, look really small, really embattled, and almost apologetic in the way that they try to cover the enormous vistas of Australian publishing now. I suspect that we're probably reviewing a smaller proportion of the total number of Australian books than we have been since maybe, well, I can't think when that would be. I remember talking to Geoffrey Blaney about the experience of being published in the 1950s, and he was saying at the time that every Australian non-fiction book could look forward to a review in every one of the major metropolitan dailies. Now, most of the major metropolitan dailies don't even run book sections now. What's the Adelaide Advertiser's book pages look like? What do the Canberra Times' book pages look like? What do the Western Australian's book pages look like? Let alone the Australian, because often when we talk about review pages, we think of the Australian, the Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, and that's it. And that's not really very much to write home about. The Australian, which probably runs as larger book pages as anyone in Australia, at the weekend they reviewed one Australian non-fiction book. Now that means they'll review 50 Australian non-fiction books a year, going on that average. That's just not enough. And it's interesting to me that I think one of the reasons why this has declined is the publishing industry has never, ever supported the books pages with advertising. It's a commercial decision by major media organisations. They see that the publishers aren't prepared to put their money where their mouth is. They publish their books pages with a grudging air because they think it's a good idea. Someone once told them that it's a good idea. But you can account for the fact that film criticism here and the coverage of someone farting in Hollywood is so enormous by the fact that they throw an awful lot of advertising money newspapers' way. Basically every film that gets a big screen release in Australia will get reviewed, and contrast that to the experience of authors. In the months since I wrote the piece, I've had a lot of conversations with people about their responses to reviews, and I'd be interested to ask Hilary whether she has that experience that she spoke of before very often, where she sees a review and she's so excited about it, so captivated that she runs out to buy the book. And maybe I'm listening more closely, but I think it's always the case. The common experience that many readers of reviews describe is that the book that they've seen reviewed has received a chorus of praise from all comers, and when they've actually gone out and read the book, they've left feeling pretty shirty. The book was unconvincing, the characters were stereotypes, the prose was leaden. So to me that suggests that we've succumbed to a practice which I think is fairly common in Australia, which is that we simply celebrate the art rather than treat it with any sort of analytical framework.
Thank you, Gideon Haigh. Rebecca Starford, did you agree with Gideon's assessment? I mean, you published his book, or did you start Kill Your Darlings because you were unhappy with the state of criticism in Australia?
No, Kill Your Darlings wasn't. We didn't start that with that intention, and there are aspects of Gideon's piece that, of course, I agree with, but there are also aspects of it that I disagree with. So I think that the nature of this debate is interesting because there seems to be a split, and I think we'll talk about this a bit more, between so-called literary criticism and reviewing, which we now see in the broadsheets. And to me, the problems that we associate with reviewing are related to the more broader problems in the broadsheets, reduction of space and all those kinds of things. So whether literary criticism is failing, I argue that it's not, but I think that split between criticism and reviewing is problematic, and the space that for actual literary criticism is, in one sense, shrinking, but also offering more opportunities for different non-traditional outlets like Kill Your Darlings, for example, where we really had the idea and the want to be producing longer critical pieces where we thought there was an absence of this, in the newspapers and traditional forms of media. So I wouldn't argue per se that it's failing, but there are issues there.
Well, I want to push back a bit too, I guess, at Gideon's assessment that things are failing, and invite Peter and Hilary to respond to that. I mean, we do have a monthly Australian Book Review. We do have a monthly Australian Literary Review. The broadsheets still do devote several pages to books on the weekend. There are a whole range of literary journals, from the established ones like Overland or Meanjin to new ones like Kill Your Darlings. And then there's a whole world out there of online writing, which offers more space. So, Peter Craven, is Gideon sort of exaggerating how bad things are? I mean, last night we were discussing film, and I think the film people would look in envy at the amount of writing that gets done about books.
Well, I mean, there are a lot more books, and your quality controls are much harder in the case of book reviewing. Like, we've been talking about book reviewing as if it was synonymous with literary criticism. Now, obviously, if you get Jeff Blaney to review a history of business, you're not dealing with literary criticism in the sense that that I write literary criticism or Owen Richardson writes literary criticism. Though, of course, what Owen or I do is a form of book reviewing. I mean, we're reviewing books, but he's not actually writing literary criticism. I think there's a lot of truth in what Gideon says. There's certainly been a diminution in volume if you think that, I think 20 years ago, the old Mogadon, the Age Monthly Review, founded by Michael Davey, who was an editor of the Age who cared about this stuff, the editor of Evelyn Waugh's diaries. There was that period, I think, where there was the Age Monthly Review, there was the Sunday Herald, which was Rupert's attempt to do a Sunday Times. It had a disastrous effect on the overall standard of Melbourne journalism, because it forced the Age to do a Sunday paper, and that Sunday paper had to be a mid-market paper, which in turn infected the daily paper. But for a brief period, you had Philippa Hawker, now the Age film critic, as the literary editor of the Sunday Herald. You had the Sunday Age itself doing books, originally rather improbably with the fair Corrie Perkin, but later with Jason Steger. And you had the Age, so that you actually had at the weekend, and there was a period when the Sun also had a respectable tabloid book reviewing section, where, for instance, you could review. Well, I think I wrote a literary column for the Sun at one stage, but I could certainly publish a review of Gore Vidal or Gerald Murnane in the Sun. So it was actually 4 sets of Melbourne literary pages, apart from the monthly review, which was comparable in size and scope to the Australian's ALR. I think the thing about book reviewing, I mean, if you've got decent theatre and film critics and you're a newspaper, then you're set. If you happen to admire Philippa and Shembry and Jake with the Age, then they're what you're going to get, whatever the films are, or David Stratton and Evan Williams with the Australian. With book reviewing, you're going to get everyone under the sun reviewing books. I think the thing about Australian book reviewing is, at the top level, it's probably as good as anything. I mean, I think Owen Richardson is a better critic than James Wood. I think Cathy Ford, who interestingly is a fiction writer as well, would compare with any of the stars you might read in the New York Review of Books, with Joyce Carol Oates or Ozick or whoever. But there's no bottom line. If you took the worst of our book reviewing, it's pretty shocking. And as someone who normally reads the book pages on a Saturday morning when I have a hangover, they're exceedingly rugged. I mean, it's a lot harder to read a middling review in the book pages of the Saturday Age or the Australian than it is to read Michelle Grattan or Michael Gordon or whoever. And that's not to say that there's anything particularly glorious about any level of Australian journalism at the moment.
And what is wrong with them?
Hilary?
I just want to ask,
come to the microphone,
Peter, what is wrong with them? Why are they so poor? I agree they're poor, but why are they?
Well, I mean,
only the newspapers, the amount of space that's allocated, and I deplore the fact that reviews are getting smaller and smaller. You can't do much with 500 words. But why are we not getting... Why is the standard so poor? Really, it is.
Well, I think at some level there can be a problem in terms of the choice of people who review books.
Yeah.
I mean, one difference, and I don't mean this as any criticism of our literary editors, but one thing which is different about the literary editors in Australia as opposed to in London, say, is that they're not especially likely to be fingertips literary people in the first place. Like, I think it's handy if you're editing book pages to be someone who, if you're put against the wall and you had to review this novel, this book of poetry, this biography, you could do it. Now, I mean, when I used to edit Scripsy, which is probably the most significant editing I've done in my life, far more significant than anything I ever did for Murray Schwartz, I used to say to people who worked for me, with the possible exception of the poetry, you should be able to write the whole thing yourself. And I would say that to sort of 20-year-olds. And obviously it was hyperbole. But I think, look at the difference, for instance, with all its faults, with all its residual stuffiness. Look at the difference, say, between Peter Rose's Australian Book Review and the average book pages.
Well, one of the differences is length. I mean, the Australian Book Review will publish reviews standard length of 1,200 words. Now, increasingly, Gideon, one of the things you pointed out is that increasingly what we're getting in the broadsheets is capsule reviews, which are 200 words.
But I think you can defend capsule reviews. I mean, you know,
the point is that you don't get you rarely get a 1,200 word review in the broadsheet papers in Australia.
Oh, I mean, I can write 1,200 words for the...
You might be able to, but most reviews...
And the Australians' review of, what's it called?
Australian Literary Review.
Yes, they certainly encourage long reviews of single titles. Yes. Although recently they've been doing 4 books at once in a single page, which I think is a great mistake, great pity for the writers.
But Gideon, you made the point that publishers haven't supported the book pages of newspapers, but, you know... AFL teams don't advertise in the sports pages. We seem to be able to manage to publish pages and pages of sport. It attracts no advertising. And yet I think there are probably as many book readers in Australia as there are avid followers of sport. Why can't books also pay their way?
Don't ask me. I think it's a great idea.
But
I'd support it in a heartbeat. But I'm not the one pulling the strings.
I mean, by celebrities that encouraged that got that advertising coverage. So
well, I mean, imagine the newspapers would say to you, their whole business model is changing. I mean, they had the Rivers of Gold, they had the classified advertising, that's all disappeared, it's all gone online, and
it's never going to come back.
It's not coming back. So how do you fund good quality critical writing, or does it go online now? Does it go somewhere else?
Places, I think it goes into.
It is interesting that criticism or reviewing has receded so badly in a climate where newspapers are absolutely full of opinion. Opinion oozes out of the simplest news stories, let alone the op-ed pages. And yet the place where opinion first flourished on the book pages, everyone seems to be, I don't know, pulling their punches. It seems pretty beige there. On the subject of capsule reviews, I think there's a genuine art to writing a capsule review. I agree. I used to write 50-word reviews for the Bulletin, and it used to take me ages because it's really, really difficult to say something worthwhile, and I tried very hard to get it right. But I think they're reviewed now in a kind of a pretty perfunctory way to give an illusion of comprehensiveness rather than because anyone regards them as being a serious, an acid test of literature.
Well, if you're being paid by the word, then you want to think about how much time you put into it.
Exactly. Well, reviewing is a very poorly paid activity for the amount of time that you invest in it. If you're going to spend the time reading a big fat book, and you're going to be paid basically what we were being paid 15 years ago, you'd almost want your head read.
I mean, it's complicated, Gideon. I mean, as someone who more or less writes about subjects I choose, and who therefore I suppose is sitting rather pretty in as much as I write, thousands of words of these things a week. Although you can make quite a tough case against the book review pages proper. I mean, I can write 2,000 words about Richard III in the A2, or apropos of the commerce of the thing, I've written many, many thousands of words about Harry Potter in my life. I think the subjects I've written about most are Shakespeare and James Joyce, because they're enthusiasms of mine and of everybody's, and J.K. Rowling. Like they will, the Saturday sections will publish thousands of words on occasion about the level of popular or trash culture which is imbibed by everybody. Like there's a new Stieg Larsson film. The second book has actually been made into a film 6 months after the first one. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I mean, one of the complexities of contemporary journalism, which I became conscious of when I did those best essay anthologies, is that all kinds of jewels exist in our newspapers, and nobody reads them, including the target audience for them. So that it's actually rather easy to do an anthology of good stuff, which has appeared in the broadsheets, because it's sitting there but no one has...
A lot of it's been overlooked, you think?
Yeah. Like, it would be interesting to do an analysis of how what appeared in the Good Weekend compared with what appeared in the Monthly. It would not be as disproportionate a comparison as you might think.
Rebecca Starford, we've been very focused on mainstream print, and I'm wondering whether you see other spaces where good literary criticism is emerging.
Yeah, I mean, certainly. Getting back to what I was saying before about the notion of I think Gideon mentioned beige reviewing, I find when I approach the reading of the broadsheets there's a lot of repetition in the content that is reviewed, and that kind of perplexes me and bothers me, particularly from an angle of working in publishing where we struggle for content, to have editorial content. And I'd be interested to know what the rest of you think about the idea of seeing, a review or an extended work on, Peter Carey's latest novel replicated virtually in every major outlet, where perhaps other titles are overlooked. And
you can't not do that, Rebecca. I mean, if there's a new Peter Carey novel, every newspaper will have to review that in the same way that they would, have to review a new Brad Pitt film or whatever. I mean, it would be unworldly to think that they wouldn't do that. I think what we could do with less of are those advertorial puff pieces about writers, which in fact publishers love, because you're going to sell far more copies of a book on the basis of a 15 or 800 word profile of the author, the convention, of course, being always, unless you invert it, like Lynn Barber and sort of bite your subject, the convention is always to be sympathetic.
Hilary McPhee, I mean, as a former publisher, I guess that's what publishers want, isn't it? They want to get the best possible coverage of their books and their writers, and part of that is creating the writer as celebrity.
Well, no. Well, it is much more now than it used to be, certainly. But why are we just talking about print? I don't quite understand that. We've got television now that covers books, and it didn't used to. I'm not saying it covers them necessarily particularly well, but it's lively coverage. And we've got, I think, a couple of the best radio programs in the English-speaking world that cover books. I mean, Ramona's program is fabulous. And
that's covering books, though. That's not reviewing or criticising, is it?
Let me pose that question. Can criticism happen on radio and television?
It can. I don't know why you're sticking to this as a print-only thing, Gideon. Can you tell me why?
Because it's about writing.
Ramona can no longer...
Well, is criticism only about
I understand, the idea of, letting 1,000 flowers bloom, but we are talking chiefly about print culture here.
Well, are we? I mean, okay, I didn't realise we were.
I think just mentioning the idea of online being a place where writing can kind of flourish, I certainly think in terms of the critical reception to books that are perhaps overlooked in the broadsheets or traditional media, that the internet is a place where conversation can happen, and I think that's what's tending to where things are tending to turn now, where readers want to converse about books that are overlooked or not kind of covered in that traditional sense. So that's opened up a space. It's not criticism, obviously, but that sense of conversation and our reading patterns in that regard have changed. So I think that's a really interesting approach and a different approach that we didn't see.
It's also part of the print culture, though. I agree. I enjoy book blogs. I've read them more often since I actually wrote the piece a few months ago, because I was conscious that I didn't know enough about the online environment for the discussion of literature, and I do enjoy them. I enjoy them chiefly for their enthusiasm, because God knows there's not an awful lot of enthusiasm on the books pages. There's a whole bunch of people just going through the motions. Where I see their shortcomings is that they seem to be chiefly about your sort of emotional or intuitive responses to a book rather than genuine criticism. It's people talking about what they feel about a book rather than perhaps what they think.
So
about
it's more
the book.
Opinion than it is criticism.
Well, I know that as a reviewer myself, I probably wasn't capable of writing a decent review until I'd read a certain critical mass of literature. And I look at my own attempts to review books when I was younger, and they're embarrassing because I just didn't know enough.
I think that's a familiar paradox, isn't it, with any kind of writing. In order to play, what kind of background do you need to play Hamlet at Stratford? It'd be a good idea if you played Hamlet at Stratford. It's you learn to write reviews, just as you learn to write any form of journalism, and people who do it well do it with a certain. They may in practice bang their heads against the wall and all the rest of it, but they give an impression of ease, and you just have to get used to it. I think the difficulty with the net, if you've ever been involved in a controversy where you've written some piece of criticism which people don't like, there is a great gulf fixed between the kind of civilised discourse you will get from the editor or the writer and what you'll get on the net, which will consist of, he's a pompous pig, what would he know, It's just kind of... It encourages a kind of flaming silliness.
There's very little quality control, I guess. So you get good things, but you also get a lot of rubbish. I want to turn it back to what criticism means for writers. And Hilary, you raised this at the beginning. How important is it to improving literature, if you like, in Australia, to have high-quality criticism?
I think it's terribly important. I think it's absolutely fundamental. And one of the problems now is we don't have much in the way of very good... this is where I agree with these two blokes. Writers don't often get the reviews they deserve. They're often bundled. If they're new writers, they're bundled as a group of 4, and all 4 are done at once, and it's hideous, and they don't learn anything much except that one's better than the other 3. And
they tend to get put together just because they're new writers.
Absolutely. And
well, the reviewer read them in that order, and by the end of it, he was getting sick of it.
Maybe.
So he decided to just slag off the last one.
But does that suggest...
Or if they're mid-list writers and they're not famous, they're bundled as well. You're asked to do 2 or 3 in the one review, and that's hopeless for no other reason other than they're both women or they're, both covering...
Yeah, don't you love that?
No, I hate it.
Women writers reviewed together because they're women.
Yeah.
But,
deep.
Are you suggesting, or should we have a kind of pro-Australian bias? Should the literary pages be making room for serious reviews of Australian literature because it's Australian literature?
Well, that's what Geordie Williamson was arguing in that very fine piece in the Australian Literary Review last week, called Bugger the Bloggers, wasn't it? Something like that.
Well, he was arguing, I think, for a number of things. What do you think, Hilary? Do you think there should be... You set up a publishing house that launched a whole string of Australian writers, and you worked hard to get those writers out there. So do the critics owe it?
Lots of people for a long time. People who hated Helen Garner and gave her a terribly hard time. Really, the reviews were savage. So we haven't had this golden era of fine reviews. New work has a very tough time in this country, and I don't think there's ever been a golden period where Australian books were reviewed in a lofty, constructive manner. There were always good examples of this, but going way back to dear old Arthur Phillips with The Cultural Cringe, there was not a lot of good reviewing back then. So I think you're making it sound as if there is a real deep culture of reviewing in this country. You're the deep culture. There is not a lot of...
Peter Craven, should there be some kind of bias towards Australian work and to making sure it gets at least considered?
I don't think there should be. That becomes
That's awful.
I'm not saying you review it favourably, but I'm saying you make sure it gets discussed.
Well, that's what ABR tries to do and has been doing since since
I think a lot of it does get discussed. I think you could make an objective. You could make a case for saying that the nearest Australian novel is, relatively speaking. I think you could make a case that there was a degree of insider trading with Australian book pages. It's not that. Well, that. A lot of relatively mediocre Australian books would be reviewed at the... Well, they might well be reviewed gently, but they would also get reviews where you might get, you know, an important biography of whoever published in London or New York, or you might get a European masterpiece and they won't get reviewed at all. Now, I'm not saying that that's necessarily good or bad, but I think it's a problem. Apropos of Geordie Williamson, I thought Geordie, who's a young man with an extraordinary sense of how far back his own memory stretches, which seems to be about 10 years, is forever discovering the wheel. You know, I mean, there was a thing 6 months ago where he was saying, you know, doesn't anyone know about this Christina Stead woman? You know, like, there is, after all, rather a long tradition of the apprehension of these things. It's a long time since, you know, Vincent Buckley and Leonie Kramer started teaching Australian literature. I mean,
well, in fact, Australian literature has declined in universities in recent years, and that raises another question, and that is, you know, do we need some kind of basic shared understanding, a sort of set of texts? I don't know, Henry Handel Richardson, Patrick White, Henry Lawson, that we can all take as assumed, and if so, who's an Australian canon, and if so, whose responsibility is that? Is it schools or is it the critics?
We need a shared understanding of everything, Peter. I mean, there's been a kind of poisoning of the wells apropos of universities.
Absolutely.
Like when you think back to sort of our childhoods, the way in which Year 12 literature syllabuses used to work would be. Someone, perhaps, you know, A.A. Phillips or whatever, would declare that this Patrick White book was very good, and so was this thing called The Leopard by this Italian fellow. And within a couple of years, those books would make their way onto the old matric syllabuses, as they were called. Now, the same thing is not happening now with, you know, Don DeLillo or...
Jonathan Franzen.
Sorry?
Jonathan Franzen.
Jonathan Franzen, or who's the young guy with an Asian background who I always... Nam Lee. Now that's an extraordinarily accomplished debut, and there's no reason why that could not be put on a school syllabus. But
probably will be. I think the schools are probably doing better with Australian stuff than the universities are.
But there isn't the ancient contract from the... which united sort of Grub Street, the universities, and then the people who taught school who cared about, you know, Cap-L literature. I mean, they might well put Nam Lee on a syllabus, but they'd put him on a syllabus, you know, together with J.K. Rowling or whatever. I mean, that's one of the other things that we haven't talked about, is the erosion of the distinction between upper-level writing and trash. I mean, there is now a market for highbrow trash.
Yep.
And a lot of people who've got tickets on themselves about what they read think that they should never reach any higher than sort of Stieg Larsson or what have you.
I want to come back to the issue of Australian literature, because Rebecca Starford, you are a publisher at a firm press, a small press. It must be, I imagine, difficult for you to get your titles, especially when you're publishing new authors, to get them actually considered and out there and read.
Yeah, it really, really is, and that is a constant battle that most small press are dealing with. We don't have the publicity and marketing machine of the larger publishers, so relying on the merits of the work alone doesn't always work in terms of getting editorial content. You know, you often need to pitch it in a particular way, and even if in fact you do happen to score, you know, a review in ALR or whatever, that doesn't necessarily mean that the work will be broadly read, because it won't necessarily translate to sales or whatever. So I think in terms of measuring the quality of work, that's an interesting concept. You know, how do we measure the quality of the writing? Is it based on how many people read it? Is it based on the way that it's received critically? Because it's certainly a challenge for us to that balance between making sure people are reading the actual book and that critical reception. So
it's never going to be based on how it's in any simple way on how it's received critically. Like, I mean, if if I review a Gerald Murnane novel and talk about the masterly modulation of monotony and the way it's comparable to a Rothko painting, I mean, all of which is true. You know, this is not going to have people lining up at
Gerald Murnane's never going to win a huge readership because...
I think too it's interesting, like Peter mentioned before, the erosion of high and low culture in the review pages. We don't see a lot of really extensive, sustained writing on sort of, you know, more lowbrow you know, works of literature which have their own importance as well.
Some people would say the distinction's been completely eroded, Rebecca, that you in fact do. That like anyone who's had occasion to take a pile of trade paperbacks to a second-hand bookseller. Second-hand booksellers are old-fashioned people who like the look of books. One of the paradoxes of contemporary publishing is that Franzen will be published as though he's popular fiction. Now, the second-hand bookseller, who may be a man, let's call him a man of limited education, will look at the book and say, well, what's this rubbish? Because it's being sold as pop, not as art. And that's, I mean, this was one of the things that used to worry...
What are you talking about, publishers' blurbs being misleading?
No, I think it's the style and the packaging. But I mean, I would argue that a lot of our biggest selling writers don't get reviewed very much. Your Bryce Courtneys or what's his name, who writes the kind of action thriller science fiction.
Matthew Riley.
Matthew Riley. They don't get much reviewed at all.
Well, they traditionally... I mean, there was a famous article by Antonia Byatt in which she was rending her garments about J.K. Rowling and saying, you know, this woman is already as rich as the Queen. Does she actually need acclaim as well? And she went into a very informed patter saying, look at Terry Pratchett. That man has never had such tickets on himself that he thought he needed sort of 1,200 words in the Observer. You know, this is trash. Let's. But see, one of the things that's happened with market economics, like the old way in which publishing worked, was that T.S. Eliot would publish The Great Escape so he could publish Kazantzakis. I think there's been a confusion with that, where some of the most sophisticated and educated publishers will actually believe in success in itself. That, you know, something has to sell a lot better than Gerald Murnane to be worth a pinch of anything.
I think one of the issues when wondering why maybe not so many people are reading the literary pages and therefore advertising isn't selling is perhaps that the kind of books that people are wanting to read about aren't in fact being reviewed in those pages. I don't know whether there's much to be said for that, but whether people are approaching these pages and being frustrated because they're not seeing the kind of books that they want to see reviewed.
But the demographic of people reading the literary pages of the newspapers is now quite ancient, isn't it? So
well, I don't know whether it is, and is that why would that be? I mean, that's the thing. If it's not, do we have to think outside? You know, try to expand the readership by appealing to broader tastes. I mean, you know, again, that's the issue of the erosion of you know, high and low.